Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. As I indicated in class, I wanted to take some time to place some finishing touches on this conversation we began today about liberation theology. And of course, I was leading out of our film, watching Romero, because there are major themes of liberation theology that crop up throughout the plot of that film. And so I want to capitalize on that and use that as a teachable moment to help us understand an important phenomenon in Latin American history during the 20th century, and that is this notion of liberation theology and sort of a new way of thinking about the role of Christianity and the faith and religion of many Latin American people, particularly in the face of the political and economic turmoil and uncertainty that characterizes much of the 20th century in Latin America. So I'll briefly go through here, so if anyone has any notes that they want to brush up on from earlier today. We covered these slides, and we left off with this slide, and we were essentially talking about the changing idea of the Catholic Church and its traditional adherence to the idea that religion and the promise of Christianity is of primary significance for focusing the attentions of people on the next world as opposed to this world. But proponents of liberation theology believed that it was actually the responsibility of officials within the church and Christians in general to try to bring justice and social justice to the experience of people on earth, to not wait for that next place to pursue justice in the here and now. And so this is an important part of that. And of course there are some echoes perhaps of Marxist thought or communist thought here, because on some level the charge is, or the duty is, to try to promote justice and something of greater equality, and for the elites within many Latin American countries and within the military, within the wealthy merchant classes, within the government officials, it could be construed that liberation theology requires a redistribution of wealth, of land, of opportunity in a way that might threaten their position. And of course in the movie Romero we see, I think firsthand, the concerns that the people who were in power and the people who had wealth and standing within Salvadoran society, they were very protective of that. They did not want to see developments that might threaten their favored, privileged position atop the apple cart. So we can hopefully start to connect these relationships. So liberation theology said that the church should derive its legitimacy and even its theology, the way it thinks about issues of Christianity, by growing out of the poor. And this means that the Bible should be read and experienced from the perspective of the poor. Sort of the whole idea of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, for theirs shall be the kingdom of heaven. Those sorts of ideas. And so the church should be a movement for those who were denied their rights and plunged into poverty, deprived of their full status and dignity as human beings. And the poor can then take the example of Jesus and use it to pursue a just society. They don't have to wait for the next world. That this is all very legitimate. In fact, a close reading of Jesus for followers of liberation theology would yield no other conclusion but to fight and strive for justice and fairness in the world that we currently inhabit. Now, things become kind of controversial, and you'll see in this image, this idea of Jesus with a rifle strapped to his back, not exactly what we think of when we think of the peaceful promise of the quote-unquote good news of Christianity. So controversially, liberationists proponents of liberation theology, said the church should act to bring about social change and should ally itself with the working class in order to do this. Some radical priests even became involved in politics and trade unions and advocated for very political causes, sometimes even bringing them to the brink of violence and sometimes even into violence. And we see this in the case of Fathers Osuna and I forget the name of the other priest in Salvador. The two priests, one of whom is tortured, the other who has the tense disagreement with Romero about the legitimacy and role of violence in the church and to what degree church officials should align themselves with violent work. We also see this in another set of expressions by many liberationists, and that is a common way that priests and nuns would show their solidarity with the overlooked and neglected classes, with the poor, was sometimes to move out of their sort of church convents and monasteries and into the neighborhoods and more directly into the lives of the people that they aim to serve, such that they would be a part of the community that these people were struggling within. And we have a great example of this, Camilo Torres Restrepo, who is a Colombian priest who essentially wrote about this and made this a very common and popular practice for various members of clergy within the Catholic Church. And you'll even see people who pursue these, who make these decisions and commit their lives to rejuvenating overlooked and neglected neighborhoods by moving there and going to serve the people directly, the people that they hope to lift up and make their lives better. So the late Pope John Paul II, who was essentially the Pope of my childhood, presided over the Catholic Church at a very interesting and challenging time. Not only was he Pope during a difficult period in Latin American history, but he was also Pope during the very easy to overlook Cold War period. Sometimes we forget that a Cold War pattern of thinking and thought very much enveloped the entire world during much of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. For your generation, it may not seem quite to be the case, but it was very powerful influence for those of us who grew up in the decades just before your generation. So the late Pope John Paul was frequently criticized for how severely he disagreed and dealt with the liberation movement. And here we have, this isn't actually Pope John Paul II, this is Pope Benedict XVI, who was our second most recent pope. But this is a famous moment in the 1980s when he, in a very public way, visited Brazil. And here we have Leonardo Boff, who was a famous Catholic priest and also a liberationist. And here he's being kind of publicly shamed. Pope Benedict XVI, who incidentally then was a cardinal, he was not yet pope, is wagging his finger at him and essentially referring to him as a naughty, wayward Catholic. And this was a very important moment that showed sort of the divide between the official church and liberationists within the church. So Pope John Paul II criticized the liberationists, and his main objection was that he wanted them to stop politicizing the theology of Catholicism. And in the 1980s, liberation theology became very widespread. He saw liberation theology as sort of a fusion of Christianity and Marxism, and the Pope was very much, as a native Pole, he was from Eastern Europe where communism had prevailed, he was fiercely anti-communist. And so the Pope was criticized for how firmly he dealt with churches and institutions that taught liberation theology, and he oftentimes removed or rebuked movement activists, folks like Leonardo Boff and Gustavo Gutierrez, both of whom were, well, Boff was from Brazil and Gutierrez was from Peru. So there was a division, of course, within the church over this matter, and so much so that the Pope was sort of pushed to clarify his stance and his specific basis for not joining with the liberationists. And in a famous quote, he said that there should be no more exploitation of the weak, racial discrimination, or ghettos of poverty. Never again. These are intolerable evils which cry out to heaven and call Christians to a different way of living, to a social commitment more in keeping with their faith. Pope John Paul II, he said this at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe while they're in Mexico in 1999. So it's important to note that the Pope was not a big fan. It wasn't that he intended to defend and promote the harsh treatment of many Latin Americans. He was just very concerned about the church's role in trying to promote social justice on earth. And so these are sort of the hearts of, this is at the heart of Pope John Paul II's concern. He believed that the church should be the voice of the oppressed. It should champion the poor. It should do these things in deed, meaning in its acts. It should show common cause and defend and advocate for the poor and downtrodden. But he was very concerned about these being political actions. He didn't want to see the church align itself with social movements or revolutions that were trying to topple the established status quo. For the Pope and many other members of the church, the risk here was that the church could become too politicized, that it could find itself only speaking and only representing certain parts of society, say ignoring the wealthy, leaving them without a religious place to call home, and believe that the role of the church was a more subtle duty that was to sort of quietly counsel, care for, and comfort the poor in the midst of their difficulty, but not necessarily to intervene and solve, just to quietly hug, remind, and support. And so this was kind of interesting. But one of the things that the Pope would regularly call attention to was how certain members of the Catholic Church, priests in fact, who had in Nicaragua integrated themselves so much into the political conflicts of Nicaragua that they had actually joined the Sandinistas, had participated in violent revolutions, and had thereby really undermined the sanctity and the purity of the church by aligning it too closely with the politics of the late 20th century. And so from this, a lot has taken place to criticize the church and for its conservatism, for its failure to embrace change and progress and proceed with the challenges of the late 20th century. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. We can start talking about it tomorrow in class. What do you think? Is Archbishop Oscar Romero, is he a liberationist in your opinion? And why or why not? What do you think? Can we put him firmly in this camp, or is he something else? And I'll leave you with that. Have a good night.